Now let's look at implementing Yum. The first thing we'll do is set up a package repository on this server, Linux CBT Serv 2. And then we'll explore using Yum to manage packages. So the features include package management, of course, and auto dependency resolution, which makes it superior to RPM. There is also the ability to specify multiple package sources. So ability to cite or specify multiple package sources, as you can with aptitude/apt within Debian. Now before we go into the details, let's mirror the content from our Debian box to the local system. So our first task is to get that going. So mirror packages directory on local system. We need to do this because the version of RPM differs in Enterprise 6 from 5 and is required in order to interact with the repository database that's going to be set up. So it needs to be on a Red Hat system running the version of RPM that's included with 6, or in a system that's running the same version of RPM. So it could be a different distribution so long as the RPM version is the same. Now we're going to place this package repository in a web accessible location. In var www.html, that's our default web root. So let's make a directory calling it RHEL6, and in RHEL6 we'll synchronize the various packages. Let's do a which LFTP. It's installed, so we'll LFTP to our Debian instance's URL, which is the following, into the package directory. So we'll just navigate to RHEL6, and let's take off the rest of this just to be sure that it works. We want to be in this directory, packages, to synchronize the content from there to our local system. So let's copy this full URL and paste it into our shell. So LFTP followed by the following will take us to that location. And locally, we are in the RHEL6 directory. So we want all of the RPMs to be available locally. Now we can use the mirror command with the verbose option to download everything to our local server. This will download all of the packages and slowly but surely create the hierarchy. From a separate shell, we can watch the directory grow. Let's duchs, for example, var www.html, and it's already at 173, 200 megs. So this is roughly 10%. So it's moving rather rapidly, and the transfer rate should be echoed per file that's being moved, but it's rather rapid, so it flies by. We're seeing on the order of 9 megabytes per second or so, times 8, 72 megabits per second, so roughly 100 base T. So that means there's probably a fast Ethernet card in Serv 2 as opposed to gigabit. But with all of that said, let's discuss what's happening here. So Yum requires that you set up a repository. So that's how it's able to access the packages and provide them to the calling client. It uses the package repository. So we need to mirror the packages directory on local system. And we do that using LFTP, followed by the URL to the directory, followed by the mirror command. That mirrors the contents of that HTTP resource. And that's what's ensuing currently. Once we have all of the RPMs available locally in our web accessible directory, the reason why we've made it web accessible is so that other Yum clients can connect to it. The next step will be to create a repository database using a special tool called create repo. So the next step for us is to run create repo, which requires that the create repo package is installed. And we'll do this against var www.html RHEL6. This will create a subdirectory, so let's just note creates subdirectory repo data and various DB files to serve packages to Yum clients. So basically, create repo reads the package directory and it opens all of the RPMs, extracts the metadata from them, and stores it into a database that can then be queried by Yum clients who have HTTP access to this server, which is why we've placed it in a web accessible directory, which means you need to have Apache running. So we'll run create repo. Now we should also note that create repo needs to be installed. So confirm that create repo RPM is installed. And again, this must be performed on a Red Hat Enterprise Linux 6 system or the same version of RPM. So locally from the shell, from a free shell, let's take this one here. We'll RPM query grep create repo. That should be the full name of the package. And this will query the list, and indeed it's open and installed and available. And if we RPM query list create repo, this will return information related to create repo, including its main binaries, which allow you to merge, modify, and create. We're interested with create, and we see a lot of Python scripts, so this should be largely done in Python. Let's take a look at the progress of the build of RWW-HTML, and in fact it's almost finished. It should be finished. Let's take a look at the mirror, and it's almost there. We're towards the end of the RPMs. So that's rather quick to move 2-point-something gigabytes of data. So now we've moved all that data. Let's quit the LFTP session, and here's your average transfer rate of just under 11 megabytes per second, or 88 megabits per second, or 88% of 100 base T, roughly. So now that the directory is in place, we don't need the full DVD tree, although you could put the full DVD tree, but then you'd need to build your repository against the packages subdirectory of the full tree, which is why we've extracted just the packages directory. So to run create repo, and we've already confirmed with RPM that create repo is installed, we'll use create repo against var www.html rel 6, and this will create the appropriate SQLite database and ancillary files to support Yum clients. And this will set up rather quickly the structure that's necessary to configure Yum. And once that's in place, we'll do the next step, which is to set up our first Yum client, which is the existing system. Again, client-server relationship. So we're currently in the rel 6 directory. Let's move a level up and run create repo, since it's relative to our current directory, against rel 6. This will index all of the various files. If you run create repo with no options, turning on help, for example, you'll see the various help that's returned. And if you scroll through, you'll see it has a verbose mode, and it'll take a base URL to base its packages off of, and it'll also allow you to specify the database file that's to be created. We're just going to go with defaults. So let's create repo with the verbose option turned on against rel 6, and this will set up the structure for us. And notice it has to query all 2679 packages, meaning it opens them, extracts the metadata, stores it into the SQLite database, and makes it queryable for the Yum clients that are out there. And part of the metadata includes dependency information, so Yum clients via the repository will be able to determine what requires what and how to install them in the order in which they should be installed, and so on. So let's just note that this queries all 2679, but this is subject to change as various subversions of Enterprise Linux 6 are published. So it queries all 2679 for the current version packages and generates a SQLite DB and ancillary files, and these will be beneath, as mentioned, the rep data, repository data directory. And then once that's in place, our next step is to set up a Yum client. So set up first Yum client, which will be, of course, the local system. This will allow us to use Yum. Now, Yum uses a global configuration file located in etc called yum.conf. In it, we can place our configuration directives. It also maintains a separate directory where we can place repositories, independent repositories. So you'll see that structure momentarily. So you may optionally place in the primary yum.conf file or in the repo directory, where the files are included as part of the larger installation. So let's explore the default config file while this runs. It's still running. It's almost done, actually. But in the interim, let's take a look at etc yum.conf, and you'll see that there's some defaults here defined for the Yum local client. So Yum uses the following log file, following cache directory, limits on installations, the fact that it should check GPG, and so on. It also notes that you should place your repositories in etc yum.repos.d. That's where we'll create a file that includes the directives that are necessary. Now, there are only a handful of directives, including a header, a name, and a base URL. There are optional directives, but those are the important ones in order to enable Yum. So we'll place a repo file with a suffix of repo in the yum.repos.d directory. So let's list that as our next step. So set up first Yum client localhost, and we'll do so in yum repos.d, and we'll create a file named linuxcbt serve2 for the local system.repo. And in this file, we will store the following, between single quotes. A header, like an INI header, which describes the name of the repository, and we'll just simply use the host name for simplicity, followed by the name of the repository, which we'll just use the same name again, followed by the base URL, which is the IP address of the local system, or the host name if DNS is properly configured, and that's going to be RHEL 6. And beneath RHEL 6, Yum will look for the repo data directory, which by now should be created. So this directive will create our first repository and can also be copied to other Yum clients, and they can begin taking advantage of Yum immediately. So let's see how our process has fared. So this is finished, and let's echo the exit status. And now when we navigate into RHEL 6 and lsltr, we see the repo data directory. And this is the directory that Yum will query. Let's change into it. And there are the files that have been created that will be cross-referenced. So this is now set. We could do a file against star, and we're set to start setting up the Yum client. So our repository is the full size, for the most part, of the DVD, sans the other directories, high availability, load balancing, etc. So now let's define this setting in the repo file, linuxcbt serve2.repo, and we need to be root to do so. So let's navigate into etc yum.repos for repositories.d, and then we'll modify linuxcbt serve2.repo for repository. This Yum framework, for those of you familiar with Debian, is similar to the apt environment. Sources.list, for example, where you specify package repositories. Now we'll paste our entry, and we'll bring it back all in. It doesn't necessarily need to be tabbed, and that should be fine. So that's our first repository. And for each repository, simply deposit a different file, and Yum will be able to use them, but try to avoid conflicts where possible. Now we've already imported the GPG key, so packages will be able to be verified via Yum. Now Yum is just a front end to RPM, but it is a much more developed front end which facilitates the auto dependency resolution that we mentioned, which is lacking with plain old RPM. So it's a wrapper to RPM, which allows us to manage our programs successfully. So now we're on to installing something. Now yum allows you to search for packages and install based on what you've searched for. Here's a list of various packages. What may be of interest to us? For example, let's see whether or not we have GFTP installed. So since we're now pros with RPM, we'll query all grep case insensitive GFTP. And then we'll also change into our old PWD and see whether or not there's a GFTP file. And there is GFS. Let's LSL gnome to see if there's a gnome-GFTP. Doesn't appear to be. Perhaps it's been removed from this version. So there doesn't appear to be anything on the FTP front. Let's LSL grep FTP to see what actually is available. There's LFTP, which is actually installed. There's VSFTP D. Let's see whether or not we've got that installed. VSFTPD. And it's searching the database, and it's not installed. So without actually delving into the VSFTPD server just yet, we could use yum to install this package. So let's set up a task from our client, our first client. So now that the client's set up, 4 is to install. Let's search first. Search and install packages. So we've selected a target. In fact, let's even use a simpler package, DOS to Unix, Unix to DOS. First, let's use RPM to remove them. So RPM E, DOS to Unix, and Unix to DOS. Let's get rid of these packages, because if we install VSFTPD, we might be inclined to begin studying it. So we don't want to do that. Let's echo the exit status. So now presumably both of those packages have been removed. Let's RPM query info DOS to Unix and Unix to DOS. So both have been removed. So we'll target DOS to Unix and Unix to DOS. So from the perspective of yum, let's do a which yum. It's in user bin. Let's RPM query file user bin yum. It belongs to the yum package. Let's RPM query configuration file yum, and yum uses yum.conf and version groups.conf, which is beneath the yum directory, and it also contains a log rotate directory, since yum writes log information to a log file beneath var log. So yum with help returns various options momentarily on how you may use yum. Again, it's a front end to RPM. To search for packages, we use the search option, and this allows us to search given a string. So for example, let's yum search DOS to Unix, a package for which we're interested. And notice it reads it's not registered with RHN, which is fine, it isn't. Yum had to go through an initialization to determine what's available on the server, 2679 packages on this particular source. And it reads that DOS to Unix is i686, and it's a text file format converter. So it is there, it is available, and can be installed. Now, if we'd like to install it, we use the install option. If you want more information about the package, then you use the info option. So for example, yum, let's just find our box here, our command, info DOS to Unix, and this should look terribly familiar as query package info. Name, architecture, version, release. These are all fields stored within the RPM metadata area, which means yum is able to use RPM and just represent it using a different interface. So it's basically just a front end. So info gives you info. Let's just note that we're running through these options. We're doing different things here. So removes both packages, and then B, yum search Unix to DOS, or DOS to Unix, doesn't matter, searches for package, and C, yum info Unix to DOS, returns /dumps /enumerates package metadata. And then, of course, install will install the package. Now, that brings up a point before we install. Supposing we specify just a fraction of the name, such as DOS to UN, or DOS to UN, or DOS to UNI. Notice it doesn't read. As if to assume it would use some sort of regular expressions matching to find the package. Now let's look through some more of these options. So you can also check for problems in the RPM database. You can remove cache data. You can downgrade a package, moving from a higher to a lower, for example. You can look at the transaction history. You can even look at a list of repositories, the repo list, to see what's currently configured from where you actually have access to a package. So for example, yum repo list will tell us the repositories that are currently configured, including the number of packages. So currently one repository with just under 2,700 packages. You can also list a particular package or groups of packages like text editors and so on. So let's go ahead and install. And we'll just modify the search, changing this to install. And this will go through the process of checking the package and installing it. Notice it reads resolving dependencies. It's checking to see whether or not there are dependencies that are unmet. And then if there were dependencies that were unmet, we'd be prompted to make a decision concerning those dependencies. So let's look at the output that's presented. Installing DOS to Unix, transaction summary. It installed the package. Well, it's actually asking us now if we want to install a package. So this is what will transpire. Architecture, version, the repository, its size. 15K will be transferred over HTTP. When extracted will be 17K, and it wants to know if it's okay. So let's include our yes command, and this will install the package momentarily. And momentarily, that's the RPM that blinked by with the hash, and now it's installed. Let's echo the exit status. Let's RPM query list DOS to Unix to see what's included with the 17K. Notice it also includes a Mac to Unix. Let's LSL user bin question mark, 3 question marks to Unix to see what's there. Notice that Mac to Unix is a shortcut to DOS to Unix. Special invocation. Also notice that the package is just under 15,000 bytes, and with its ancillary components, the man pages, the directories that are created in total, it's 17,000 bytes as projected by the yum installer. Now what if you try to reinstall the same package using yum? Let's see how it resolves it. Comes back with nothing to do because it's already installed and it's the latest version according to the repositories that are set up. If multiple repositories are set up and a later version exists on one of the repositories, then that discrepancy can be handled at that particular point. But in this case, there's only one repository, so insofar as yum is concerned, we have the latest version. So it's really a check against all of the versions across all repositories to determine whether or not we have the latest version. Now, supposing you wanted to reinstall a package because for some reason something's broken, such as one of the files because of a failed RPM verification check. So if you insist and you specify the reinstall option, you're prompted yet again to reinstall the package. This is akin to the replace packages option when installing a package or upgrading a package. So let's just note yum install Unix to DOS and installs the package once. However, if it needs to be reinstalled, use yum reinstall Unix to DOS. Reinstalls package, i.e., like the replace packages option with RPM. which allows you to reinstall. And you can effect this reinstallation multiple times. We have cited Unix to DOS when we've installed DOS to Unix, but that's fine because we're going to install the Unix to DOS command momentarily. Now, what if you try to reinstall a package that's not installed, like Unix to DOS, for example? Well, if you attempt to reinstall the package, it's searching, and it says there's another app running. Let's see what's going on. And it says it's available, but it's not installed. So eventually it was able to run, and it knows that it's not installed. So trying to reinstall something that is not installed will not work. You need to install it. So let's install it, and this will put Unix to DOS, which will match our notes, which also is 14,000 bytes in its RPM, but 16,000 bytes on the file system. And now if we RPM queryless Unix to DOS, we should see its contents, which include the Unix to DOS binary, a man page, and the documentation directory, which contains a copyright file. Now, another option that might be useful if you're installing packages, especially in some sort of unattended or mass mode, is to use the assume yes option or Y option. So yum y reinstall Unix to DOS, for example, will answer yes for you wherever possible, unless there's something that you must answer manually. So let's assume yes for the installation process, and when it gets to the stage, unless it needs you to specify yes, it will automatically install it for you, as we see in that particular case. So that saves us a step. So assumes yes when prompted, which promotes an installation that doesn't require as much intervention. Now, supposing you'd like to see a history of commands, like a command line history with bash, of yum commands that have been effected on your system, which of course will be telling of what's been installed and removed, and potentially by whom. Yum history will return that. So returns usage history. And this is, i.e., like the bash shell history, which is queryable and can be quite useful, especially for auditing purposes, to determine what's changed on your system. So let's look at the yum history to see what's occurred thus far. And here we see the various actions. Reinstall, install, reinstall, so on and so forth. And it's all been logged with the various timestamps. And of course this should be root who performs these particular steps. Which leads us to another point. Supposing you wanted to be able to remove the packages recently installed. Of course, just like with RPM, you can. Remember, the key with yum is that it's streamlined. It's a wrapper to RPM, which allows us to auto-resolve dependencies. So it does everything RPM does and then some. So supposing we wanted to remove these packages, just use the erase option. So yum erase Unix to DOS, for example, which begs the question, can we specify both packages? So Unix to DOS, DOS to Unix, which are two distinct packages. And of course, this will prompt us for the yes option. But first, let's see how yum handles a list of items. And notice it knows that two packages are to be removed because we indicated them separated by spaces. And here are their sizes, and we're prompted. Now, what about the assume yes option? Let's say it's not okay, and let's say we want to intervene with the assume yes option on an erase. So notice in this case, it's erasing the packages without prompting us. So both packages have been removed. Let's just include in our notes that if you include the yes option, it works here as well. It doesn't always work, but it works most of the time. So assumes yes and removes both packages. Which means, of course, if we try to search or use RPM to search our database for either DOS to Unix or Unix to DOS, nothing's there. So it's been removed from our system. Both can be specified as well on the same command line. Now, supposing you wanted to be able to see the dependencies of a package, there's an option for that as well. And that's yum dep lists or dependency lists. So supposing we're not clear about how to install, let's say, LFTP, which is currently installed, and we'd like to see a list of dependencies.